The relationship that defined a continent has reached a breaking point. For years, the world watched as Donald Trump demanded, threatened, and cajoled America's closest allies, expecting them to bend to his will. But one leader, quietly and with immense strategic calculation, never did. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who became Prime Minister of Canada, orchestrated a masterclass in diplomatic defiance. This is not a story of public feuds or angry tweets. It is a story of profound, deliberate resistance conducted in the shadows of power with the future of a nation at stake. The question has lingered since the day Carney took office. How did he manage to navigate the turbulent, often vindictive politics of the Trump era without conceding to the immense pressure? The answer is a complex tapestry of economic foresight, intelligence preparation, and a radical reimagining of Canada's place in the world. It begins not with a public showdown, but with a private, stark assessment. Within weeks of his election, Carney was briefed by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, and the Communications Security Establishment, CSE. The intelligence was chilling. It outlined a detailed blueprint of Trump's anticipated second-term priorities: a wholesale withdrawal from NATO commitments, punitive bilateral trade actions, and a forced decoupling from China that would devastate export-dependent economies. The briefings predicted specific demands would be made of Canada, demands that would compromise its sovereignty, eviscerate its social programs, and chain its economy permanently to the volatile whims of American domestic politics. Carney, a central banker who steered the global financial system through the 2008 crisis, understood risk better than any politician. He saw Trump not merely as a difficult partner, but as a systemic risk to Canada's national stability. The traditional Canadian playbook of quiet accommodation, of waiting out the storm, was deemed insufficient. A new strategy was required. Thus began Project Anchor, a clandestine, whole-of-government initiative known only to a tight cabinet committee. Its goal was not to provoke a conflict, but to build an unassailable economic and diplomatic fortress around Canada before the conflict arrived. The first pillar was energy independence. Trump's obsession with controlling North American energy was well documented. He wanted guaranteed below-market access to Canadian oil, gas, and electricity to fuel U.S. industry and hold global prices hostage. Carney's response was a revolutionary piece of legislation quietly passed as part of an omnibus budget bill. It created the Canadian Energy Security Corridor, a national strategy to build east-west electricity transmission lines and pipeline capacity, explicitly prioritizing domestic and transatlantic energy links over southbound exports. Billions were allocated to interconnect provinces, making Canada's grid a self-sufficient, renewable-powered web. This meant that when Trump eventually demanded Canadian hydropower for New York, Canada could legally and technically say no. The power was needed in Ontario or for export to Europe via new subsea cables already in planning. The second pillar was trade diversification. While Trump railed against multilateralism, Carney's trade minister was on a secret whirlwind tour. In one 18-month period, they finalized the modernization of the Canada-UK Trade Continuity Agreement, accelerated the implementation of the CPTPP with Asia, and, most crucially, deepened the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with the European Union to unprecedented levels. The hidden coup within CETA was a side agreement on regulatory harmonization for critical minerals. This created a de facto EU-Canada supply chain for batteries and semiconductors, completely bypassing the United States. When U.S. automakers, pressured by the White House, later demanded exclusive access to Canadian lithium, they were told contracts were already locked in with European consortiums for 20 years. The third pillar was financial insulation. Carney, leveraging his unparalleled global financial network, engineered a subtle but powerful shift. He encouraged the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, CPPIB, and other sovereign wealth funds to dramatically reduce exposure to U.S. dollar-denominated assets vulnerable to political shock. Investments were redirected into Asian infrastructure, European green technology, and domestic Canadian projects. Simultaneously, the Bank of Canada, in coordination with the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, expanded currency swap lines, creating a protective liquidity moat around the Canadian dollar. If Trump ever moved to weaponize the dollar, Canada had a backdoor exit. The operational security around these moves was intense. Meetings were held in secure facilities, Documents were air-gapped. Communication with certain international partners used dedicated, encrypted channels outside the Five Eyes network, a nearly unthinkable step for Canada. The government knew that early discovery would trigger a devastating, preemptive strike from Washington. The political narrative at home was carefully managed. Carney's public speeches never mentioned Trump. He spoke of building resilience, generational opportunities, and Canadian sovereignty. His opponent, Pierre Poilievre, attacked him for not being more obsequious to Washington, for missing opportunities with the U.S. This played perfectly into Carney's hands. He let the criticism mount, all while the fortress walls grew higher unseen. The moment of truth arrived in the spring of 2025. A high-level U.S. delegation, led by a notoriously abrasive Trump lieutenant, arrived in Ottawa with a list of non-negotiable demands. They wanted a new NAFTA 2.0 that would force Canada to abandon its digital services tax on American tech giants, grant the U.S. first right of refusal on all critical mineral output, and accept a quota on automotive exports that would effectively move production south. The meeting was held in the Langevin block. Carney, informed by intelligence intercepts of the delegation's internal strategy, was prepared. He listened politely, then he declined every single demand. He cited Canadian law, international agreements, and prior commitments to other partners. He offered instead a framework for collaboration based on mutual respect, a diplomatic formulation he knew would be rejected. The U.S. delegation was stunned. They threatened tariffs, they threatened border delays, they hinted at security cooperation being withdrawn. Carney remained calm. He stated that Canada would view any unilateral trade actions as violations of the USMCA and would respond with proportionate, targeted countermeasures within the rules of the World Trade Organization. He then concluded the meeting. The delegation left empty-handed. The aftermath was a masterclass in controlled escalation. Trump predictably erupted on social media, calling Carney weak and disrespectful. He announced plans for tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum again. But Carney's retaliation was not symbolic. Within hours, Canada's finance minister announced a reciprocal tariff schedule, but with a devastating twist. It targeted products manufactured in key congressional districts whose representatives chaired committees critical to Trump's legislative agenda. It was a surgical political strike. Simultaneously, the Canadian Minister of Natural Resources released a statement noting that due to supply commitments, exports of rare earth minerals to the U.S. defense sector would be reduced by 50% for the next quarter. The Pentagon, which had been assured by the White House that Canada was a pushover, went into quiet panic. The intelligence community had prepared for this. CSIS had long identified the networks of Trump loyalists embedded within U.S. industry groups. They anticipated the lobbying campaign that would follow. Canadian officials were ready with dossiers of information, ready to brief sympathetic U.S. senators and journalists on the consequences of a trade war. The narrative was flipped. It was not Canada being difficult, but the U.S. administration endangering its own supply chains and national security. The diplomatic flank was secured. Carney had pre-briefed the European Commission and the UK government. They issued coordinated statements expressing deep concern over U.S. actions and reaffirming their unshakable trade partnerships with Canada. This globalized the dispute, preventing Trump from isolating Canada. The historical resonance was profound. This was not the placatory Canada of the 2003 Iraq War descent. This was not the renegotiation of NAFTA, where Canada made painful concessions. This was a sovereign nation, fully prepared, drawing a line with steely resolve. It called to mind the defiance of Lester B. Pearson during the Suez Crisis, but with far greater economic and strategic stakes. The financial markets, rather than panicking, saw Canada's actions as evidence of stability. The Canadian dollar held firm. Investment flowed into the sectors Carney had fortified. The Fortress Canada strategy was proving its worth. The revelations of how deep the preparation went are still emerging. It can now be disclosed that Canadian officials, in secret talks with California and New York, established subnational climate and energy partnerships that bypassed the federal U.S. government entirely. They created a coalition of the willing within the United States itself. Furthermore, Canada accelerated its Arctic sovereignty presence, deploying new surveillance satellites and icebreakers, a signal to Moscow, but also to Washington, that the Canadian North was not a bargaining chip. The human element within the Canadian government was one of immense stress, but also unity. Public servants, long accustomed to following the U.S. lead, were retrained to think in terms of strategic autonomy. A generation of diplomats and trade negotiators found a new confidence. The psychological shift inside Ottawa was as important as the policy shifts. The conclusion is inescapable. Mark Carney never gave Donald Trump what he wanted because he had spent years building a Canada that didn't have to. He transformed the nation's deepest vulnerability, its economic dependence on the United States, into a position of surprising strength. He understood that in the face of transactional, zero-sum demands, the only winning move is to change the game entirely. He didn't just say no. He built an entire alternative architecture for Canadian prosperity, one with its foundations anchored far from the turbulent shores of American politics. The legacy of this defiance will shape North America for decades. It proves that a middle power with intelligence, preparation, and unwavering resolve can stare down a superpower's ultimatum. It marks the end of a long era of automatic deference and the birth of a new, more self-assured nation. The story is not one of a single dramatic confrontation, but of 1,000 careful preparations that made the final no not an act of bravery, but an inevitable statement of fact. Canada, under Carney, had moved on, and it never looked back.